Max Media, Incorporated. This unabridged audiobook is recorded by arrangement with Del Rey Books, an imprint of the Random House Publishing Group, a division of Random House Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Prologue. When Ifech felt the sea shudder, he knew. The wind had already fallen like a dead thing from the sky, gasping as it succumbed upon the iron's swells, breathing its last to his mariner's ears. The sky always knew first. The sea was slow, dreadful slow, to come around. The sea shook again, or rather seemed to drag beneath their keel. Up in the crow's nest, Keem screamed as he was tossed out like a kitten. Ifech watched him twist and almost impossibly catch the rigging with those Cathay Rat claws of his. "Stendar," Grain swore in her South Nibbon twang. "What was that? A tsunami?" Her feeble human gaze searched out through the dusk. "No," Ifech murmured. "I was off the Somerset Isles when the sea tried to swallow them, and I felt one of those pass under us. And another when I was younger off the coast of Morrowind. In deep water you don't feel much. This is deep water." "Then what?" She brushed her silver and grey bangs off her useless eyes. Ifech twitched his shoulders in imitation of a human shrug and ran his claws through the patchy fur of his forearm. The still air smelled sweet, like rotting fruit. "See anything, Keem?" he called up. "My own death, nearly!" the Naquin alien cat shouted back, his voice rasping hollow, as if the ship was in a box. He lithely hauled his sleek body back into the nest. "Nothing on the sea," he continued after a moment. "Under it, then," Grain said nervously. Ifech shook his head. "The wind," he said. And then he saw it, in the south, a sudden blackness, a crackle of green lightning, and then a form like a tall thunderhead billowed into being. "Hold on!" he shouted. And now came a clap like thunder, but 40 times louder, and a new fist of wind that snapped the mainmast, taking poor Keem to the death he had nearly seen. Then all was still again, except for the roaring in his damaged ears. "By the gods, what can it be?" he barely heard Grain ask. "The sea doesn't care," Ifech said, watching the dark mass move toward them. He looked around his ship. All of the masts were broken, and it appeared that half the crew was already gone. "What?" "Not many Khajiit take to the sea," he said. "They'll bear it for trade, to move skooma around, but few there are who love her. But I've adored her since I could mule, and I love her because she doesn't care what the gods or Daedra think. She's another world with her own rules." "What are you going on about?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I feel it, I don't think it. But don't you think, doesn't it feel like—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Grain stared out toward the thing. "I see it now," she said. "Yes." "I saw an Oblivion Gate open once," she said, "when my father worked in Leaween. I saw things. It feels a little like that. But Martin's sacrifice, they say it can't happen again. And it doesn't look like a gate." It wasn't shaped like a thunderhead, Ifech realized, more like a fat cone, point down. Another wind was starting up, and on it something unbelievably foul. "It doesn't matter what it is," he said. "Not to us." And a few instants later,
luck finding the lichen? We'll need to be quick if we want full potency.
Sul's throat hurt, so he knew he had been screaming.
It's subtle,
He was soaked with sweat, his chest ached, and his limbs were trembling. He opened his eyes and forced his head up so he could see where he was. A man stood in the doorway with a drawn sword. His eyes were very wide and blue beneath a shock of curly, barley-colored hair. Swearing, Saul reached for his own weapon where it hung on the bedpost. "Just hold on there," the fellow said, backing up. "It's just you've been hollering so, I was worried something was happening to you." The dream light was still fading, but his mind was starting to turn. If the fellow had wanted him dead, he probably would be. "Where am I?" he asked, taking a grip on his long sword, despite his reasoning. "In the Lankfellow Inn," the man replied, and then, after a pause, "in Chorol." Chorol, right. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Saul said. "Nothing to concern you." "Ah, yes." The man looked uncomfortable. "Do you, scream like that every—" "I won't be here tonight." Saul cut him off. "I'm moving on." "I didn't mean to offend." "You didn't," Saul replied.
Did you see the look on his
"The breakfast
face?
is out, down there."
He certainly
"Thank
wasn't
you.
exaggerating about
Please
that
leave me."
allergy.
The man closed
As
the
much
door.
as I'd like to,
Saul sat there
you
for
know
a
the
moment,
healers
rubbing
both
the lines in
do
his
only
forehead.
moderate harm to those who
"Azura,"
oppose you.
he murmured.
I brewed a
He
tea
always
that
knew
should
the
alleviate
prince's
his
touch,
symptoms.
even when it
You
was
can give
light.
it to him.
This
But
had
only
not
if he
been
agrees
light.
to come out and...
He closed his
Then
eyes
leave
and
him
tried
to
to
sniffles
feel
and
the sea
blubbering.
jump beneath
Patients tend
him,
to
to hear
avoid
the
those
old
covered in
Khajiit
road
captain's
smoked.
words, see
He gets
again
his
through his
business with his
eyes.
reputation
That
intact.
thing
All
appearing
he
in the
needs to do.
sky, everything about it stank of oblivion. After spending 20 years there, he ought to know the smell. "Vuhon," he sighed. "It must be you, Vuhon, I think. Why else would the prince send me such a vision? What else would matter to me?" No one answered, of course. He remembered a little more after the Khajiit had died. He had seen Iljaven as he last saw her, pale and lifeless, and the smoking Shadowlands that had once been Morrowind. Those were always there in his dreams, whether Azura meddled with them or not. But there had been another face, a young man, Colovian probably, with a slight bend in his nose. He seemed familiar, as if they had met somewhere. "That's all I get?" Saul asked. "I don't even know which ocean to look in." The question was directed at Azura, but he knew it was rhetorical. He also knew he was lucky to get even that. He dragged his wiry grey body out of bed and went over to the wash basin to splash water in his face and blink red eyes at himself in the mirror. He started to turn away when he noticed, behind him in the reflection, a couple of books propped in an otherwise empty shelf. He turned, walked over, and lifted the first.
So, did Menel
"Tales of Southern
Oh,
Waters,"
thank goodness.
it announced.
luring cats to his door
He nodded
every
his
day
head
would
and
have gotten
opened the
awfully
second.
tiresome.
"The most current and high adventures of Prince Atribus," this one read. And there, on the frontispiece, was an engraving of a young man's face with a slightly crooked nose. For the first time in years, Saul uttered a hoarse laugh. "Well, there you go," he said. "I'm sorry I doubted you, my prince."
And...
An hour later, armed and armored, he rode south and east toward madness, retribution, and death. And though he had long ago forgotten what happiness was, he imagined it must have been a bit like what he felt now.
There's no reason for us to be at odds. We should try to
Part
cooperate,
1.
yes?
Arrival. 1.
Yes.
A pale young woman with long ebon curls, and a male with muddy green scales and chocolate spines, crouched on the high rafters of a rotting villa in Lilmoth, known by some as the festering jewel of Black Marsh. "You're finally going to kill me," the reptile told the woman. His tone was thoughtful, his saurian features composed in the faint light bleeding down through the cracked slate roof. "Not so much kill you as get you killed," she answered, pushing the tight rings of her hair off her face and pressing her slightly aquiline nose and grey-green gaze toward the vast open space beneath them. "It works out the same," the other hissed. "Come on, Glim," Anaik said, tossing herself into her father's huge leather chair and clasping her hands behind her neck. "We can't pass this up." "Oh, I think it can be safely said that we can," Mir Glim replied. He lounged on a low weave cane couch, one arm draped so as to suspend over a cypress end table whose surface was supported by the figure of a crouching Khajiit warrior. The Argonian was all silhouette, because behind him the white curtains that draped the massive bay windows of the study were soaked in sunlight. "Here are some things we could do instead." He ticked one glossy black claw on the table. "Stay here in your father's villa and drink his wine." A second claw came down. "Take some of your father's wine down to the docks and drink it there." The third. "Drink some here and some down at the docks." "Glim, how long has it been since we had an adventure?" His lazy lizard gaze traveled over her face. "If by adventure you mean some tiring or dangerous exercise, not that long. Not long enough, anyway." He wiggled the fingers of both hands, as if trying to shake something sticky off them, a peculiarly Lilmothian expression of agitation. The membranes between his digits shone translucent green. "Have you been reading again?" He made it sound like an accusation, as if reading was another way of referring to, say, infanticide. "A bit," she admitted. "What else am I to do? It's so boring here. Nothing ever happens." "Not for lack of your trying," Mere Glim replied. "We very nearly got arrested during your last little adventure." "Yes, and didn't you feel alive?" she said. "I don't need to feel alive," the Argonian replied. "I am alive, which state I would prefer to retain." "You know what I mean." "That's a bold assertion," he sniffed. "I'm a bold girl." She sat forward. "Come on, Glim. He's a were-crocodile. I'm certain of it, and we can get the proof." "First of all," Mere Glim said, "there's no such thing as a were-crocodile. Second, if there were, why on earth would we care to prove it? Because people would want to know. We'd be famous, and he's dangerous. People around there are always disappearing." "In Pass Bottom? Of course they are. It's one of the dodgiest parts of town." "Look," she said, "they've found people bitten in half. What else could do that?" "A regular crocodile. Lots of things, really. With some effort, I might be able to do it too." He fidgeted again. "Look, if you're so sure about this, get your father to talk Underwarden Efton into sending some guards down there." "Well, what if I'm wrong? Father would look stupid." "That's what I'm saying, Glim. I need to know for sure. I must find some sort of proof. I've been following him." "You've what?" He gaped his mouth in incredulity. "He looks human, Glim, but he comes and goes out of the canal like an Argonian. That's how I noticed him. And when I looked where he came out, I'm sure the first few steps were made by a crocodile, and after that by a man." Glim closed his mouth and shook his head. "Or a man stepped in some crocodile tracks," he said. "There are potions and amulets that let even you gaspers breathe underwater." "But he does it all the time. Why would he do that? Help me be sure, Glim." Her friend sibilated a long hiss. "Then can we drink your father's wine?" "If he hasn't drunk it all." "Fine." She clapped her hands in delight. "Excellent. I know his routine. He won't be back in his lair until nightfall, so we should go now." "Lair?" "Sure. That's what it would be, wouldn't it? A lair." "Fine, a lair. Lead on." And now here we are, Anaik thought. They had made their way from the hills of the old Imperial Quarter into the ancient gangrenous heart of Lilmoth, Pussbottom. Imperials had dwelt here, too, in the early days when the Empire had first imposed its will and architecture on the lizard people of Black Marsh. Now only the desperate and sinister dwelt here, where patrols rarely came, the poorest of the poor, political enemies of the Argonian and Xilil party that now dominated the city, criminals and monsters. They found the lair easily enough, which turned out to be a livable corner of a manse so ancient the first floor was entirely silted up. What remained was vastly cavernous and rickety, and not that unusual in this part of town. What was odd was that it wasn't full of squatters. There was just the one. He had furnished the place with mostly junk, but there were a few nice chairs and a decent bed. That's about all they got to see before they heard the voices, coming in the same way they had, which was to say the only way. Anaig and Glim were backed up in the corner, and here the walls were stone. The only way to go was up an old staircase, and then even farther, using the ancient frame of the house as a ladder. Anaig wondered what sort of wood, if wood it was, could resist decomposition for so long. The wall and floorboards here had been made of something else, and were almost like paper. So they had to take care to stay on the beams. Glim hushed himself. The figures in the group below were gazing up, not at them, but in their vague direction. Anaig took a small vial from the left pocket of her double-breasted jacket and drank its contents. It tasted a bit like melon, but very bitter. She felt her lungs fill and empty, the elastic pull of her body around her bones. Her heart seemed to be vibrating instead of beating, and the oddest thing was she couldn't tell if this was fear. The faint noises below suddenly became much louder, as if she was standing among them.
"Where is he?"
one of the figures asked. They were hard to make out in the dim light, but this one looked darker than the rest, possibly a Dunmer.
"He'll be here,"
another said. He, or maybe she, was obviously a Khajiit. Everything about the way he moved was feline.
"He will,"
a third voice said. Anaig watched as the man she had been following for the last few days approached the others. Like them, he was too far away to see, but she knew him by the hump of his back, and her memory filled in the details of his brutish face and long, unkempt hair.
"Do you have it?"
the Khajiit asked.
"Just brought it in under the river."
"Seems like a lot of trouble,"
the Khajiit said.
"I've always wondered why you don't use an Argonian for that."
"I don't trust them. Besides, they have ripper eels trained to hunt Argonians trying to cross the outer canal. They're not so good at spotting me, especially if I rub myself with eel slime first."
"Disgusting. You can keep your end of the job."
"Just as long as I get paid for it."
He pulled off his shirt and removed his hump.
"Have a look. Have a taste if you want."
"Oh, Daedra and Divines," Anaig swore from the beam they crouched on. "He's not a werecroc. He's a skooma smuggler."
"You're finally going to kill me,"
Glim said.
"Not so much kill you as get you killed." "It works out the same."
And now Anaig was quite sure that what she felt was fear. Bright, terrible animal fear.
"By the way,"
the Khajiit below said, lowering his voice,
"who are those two in the rafters?"
The man looked up.
"Xuth if I know,"
he said.
"None of mine."
"I hope not. I sent Patch and Flix up to kill them."
"Oh, cock!" Anaig hissed. "Come on, Glim." As she stood, something whisked through the air near her, and a shriek tore out of her throat.
"I knew it,"
Glim snapped. "Just come on! We have to get to the roof!" They ran across the beams, and someone behind her shouted. She could hear their footfalls now. Why hadn't she before? An enchantment of some sort? "There," Glim said. She saw it. Part of the roof had caved in and was resting on the rafters, forming a ramp. They scrambled up it. Something hot and wet was trying to pull out of her chest, and she hysterically wondered if an arrow hadn't hit her, if she wasn't bleeding inside. But they made it to the roof. And a 50-foot fall. She pulled out 2 vials and handed one to Mere Glim. "Drink this and jump," she said.
"What? What is it?"
I'm not sure. It's supposed to make us fly."
"Supposed to? Where did you get it?"
"Why is that important?"
"Oh, Thal, you made it, didn't you? Without a formula. Remember that stuff that was supposed to make me invisible?"
"It made you sort of invisible."
"It made my skin translucent. I looked like a bag of offal walking around."
She drank hers. No time, Glim. It's our only hope. Their pursuers were coming up the ramp, so she jumped, wondering if she should flap her arms or... But what she did was fall and shriek. But then she wasn't falling so fast, and then she was sort of drifting, so the wind actually pushed her like a soap bubble. She heard the men hollering from the roof and turned to see Glim floating just behind her. "See," she said, "you need to have a little faith in me." She barely got the sentence out before they were falling again. Later, battered, sore, and stinking of the trash pile that broke their final fall, they returned to her father's villa. They found him passed out in the same chair Anaïg had been in earlier that morning. She stood looking at him for a moment, at his pale fingers clutched on a wine bottle, at his thinning grey hair. She was trying to remember the man he had been before her mother died, before the Anxilil wrested Lilmoth from the Empire and looted their estates. She couldn't see him. "Come on," she told Glim. They took 3 bottles of wine from the cellar and wound their way up the spiral stair to the upper balcony. She lit a small paper lantern, and in its light poured full 2 delicate crystal goblets. "To us," she said. They drank. Old imperial Lilmoth spread below them, crumbling hulks of villas festooned with vines and grounds overgrown with sleeping palms and bamboo, all dark now, as if cut from black velvet, except where illumined by the pale phosphorescences of Lucan mold or the wispy yellow airborne shines, harmless cousins of the deadly will-o'-wisps in the deep swamps. "There now," she said, refilling her glass. "Don't you feel more alive?" He blinked his eyes very slowly. "Well, I certainly feel more aware of the contrast between life and death," he replied. "That's a start," she said. A small moment passed. "We were lucky," Glim said. "I know," she replied, "but..." "What?" "Well, it's no werecrock, but we can at least report the skooma dealers to the Underwarden. They'll have moved by then, and even if they catch them, that's a drop of water in the ocean. There's no stopping the skooma trade." "There certainly isn't if no one tries," she replied. "No offense, Glim, but I wish we were still in the Empire." "No doubt. Then your father would still be a wealthy man, and not a poorly paid advisor to the Anxilil." "It's not that," she said. There was justice under the Empire. There was honor." "You weren't even born." "Yes, but I can read, Mere Glim." "But who wrote those books? Bretons, Imperials." "And that's Anxilil propaganda. The Empire is rebuilding itself. Titus Mede started it, and now his son Atribus is at his side. They're bringing order back to the world, and we're just dreaming ourselves away here, waiting for things to get better by themselves." The Argonian gave his imitation shrug. "There are worse places than Lilmoth. There are better places, too. Places we could go, places where we could make a difference." "Is this your Imperial City speech again? I like it here. It's my home. We've known each other since we were hatchlings, yes. And if you didn't already know, you could talk me into almost anything. You do now. But leaving Black Marsh, that you won't get me to do. Don't even try. Don't you want more out of life, Glim? Food, drink, good times. Why should anyone want more than that? It's people wanting to make a difference causing all the troubles in the world. People who think they know what's better for everyone else. People who believe they know what other people need but never bother to ask. That's what your Titus Mede is spreading around. His version of how things ought to be, right? There is such a thing as right and wrong, Glim. Good and evil. If you say so. Prince Atribus rescued an entire colony of your people from slavery. How do you think they feel about the Empire? My people knew slavery under the old Empire. We knew it pretty well. Yes, but that was ending when the Oblivion Crisis happened. Look, even you have to admit that if Merunes Dagon had won, if Martin hadn't beaten him... Martin and the Empire didn't beat him in Black Marsh, Glim said, his voice rising. The Anxilil did. When the gates opened, Argonians poured into oblivion with such fury and might, Dagon's lieutenants had to close them. Anaig realized that she was leaning away from her friend and that her pulse had picked up. She smelled something sharp and faintly sulphurous. Amazed, she regarded him for a moment. Yes, she finally said, when the scent diminished. But without Martin's sacrifice, Dagon would have eventually taken Black Marsh too, and made this world his sport ground. Glim shifted and held out his glass to be refilled. I don't want to argue about this, he said. I don't see that it's important. You sounded as if you thought so for a second there, old friend. I thought I heard a little passion in your voice, and you smelled like you were spoiling for a fight. It's just the wine, he muttered, waving it off, and all of the excitement. For the rest of the night, can we just celebrate that your flying potion wasn't a complete failure? She was starting to feel warm in her belly, the wine at its business. Well, yes, she said. I suppose that's worth a toast or two. They drank those, and then Glim looked a little sidewise at her. Anyway, he began, then stopped. What? He grinned his lizard grin and shook his head. You may not have to go looking for trouble. From what I heard, it might be coming for us. What's this? The Wind Oracle put into port today. Your cousin Ixtanasha's boat. Yeah. Says he saw something out on the deep. Something coming this way.
At last.
Something.
Did you
That's the crazy part. He said it looked like an island with a city on it. An uncharted island? An unmoored island. Floating in the air. Flying. Anaig frowned, set her glass down and wagged a finger at him. That's not funny, Glim. You're teasing me. No, I wasn't going to tell you, but the wine. She sat up straighter in her chair. You're serious? Coming this way? That's what he said. Huh, she replied, taking up the wine again and sinking back into her chair. I'll have to think about that. A flying city. Sounds like something left over from the Merithic era, or before. She felt her ample mouth pull in a huge smile. Exciting? I'd better go see Hector tomorrow. And so they finished that bottle and opened another, an expensive one. And outside the rains came, as they always did, a moving curtain glittering in the lamplight, clean and wet, washing away, for the moment, Lilmoth's scent of mildew and decay.
Perhaps one of the priests vivexed
2.
away.
A boy was once born with a knife instead of a right hand, or so Colin had heard. Rape and attempted murder planted him in his mother, but she had lived and turned all of her thoughts toward vengeance. She laughed when he carved his way out of her and went gleefully into the world to slaughter all who had wronged her and many who had not. And when his victims were drowning in their own blood, they might ask, "Who are you?" And he would answer simply, "Dog," which in the northern tongue is an old word for knife. According to the legend, it happened in Skyrim, but assassins liked the story, and it wasn't that uncommon for a brash, young, up-and-coming killer to take that alias and daydream of making that cryptic reply. The knife in Colin's hand didn't feel remotely a part of him. The handle was slick and clammy, and it made his arm feel huge and obvious, hanging by his side just under the edge of his cloak. Why hadn't the man noticed him? He was just standing there, leaning against the banister of the bridge, staring off toward the lighthouse. He came here each Loredas, after visiting his horse at the stables. Often he met someone here. There was a brief conversation, and they would part. He never spoke to the same person twice. Colin continued toward him. There was traffic on the bridge, mostly folks from Way going home for the night with their wagons and the things they hadn't sold at market, lovers trying to find a nice place to be secret. But it was thinning out. They were almost alone. "There you are," the man said. His face was hard to see, as it was cast in shadow by a watchlight a little farther up. Colin knew it well, though. It was long and bony. His hair was black with a little grey, his eyes startling blue. "Here I am," Colin replied, his mouth feeling dry. "Come on over." A few steps and Colin was standing next to him. A group of students from the College of Whispers were loudly approaching. "I like this place," the man said. "I like to hear the bells of the ships and see the light. It reminds me of the sea. Do you know the sea?" "Shut up," Colin thought. "Please don't talk to me." The students were dithering, pointing at something in the hills northwest. "I'm from Unville," Colin said, unable to think of anything but the truth. "Ah, nice town, Anvil. What's that place, the one with the dark beer?" "The Undertow." The man smiled. "Right, I like that place." He sighed and ran his fingers through his hair.
Please,
"What times, eh? I used to have a beautiful villa on the headland off Topal Bay. I had a little boat, 2 sails, just for flying near the coast. Now," he raised his hands and let them drop. "But you didn't come here for any of that, did you?" The students were finally moving off, talking busily in what sounded like a made-up language. "I guess not," Colin agreed. His arm felt larger than ever, with a knife like a stone in his hand. "No. Well, it's simple today. You can tell them there's nothing new. And if anyone asks, tell them that no food, no wine, no lover's kiss is as beautiful as a long, deep breath." "What?" "A story. Book 3, chapter... What are you holding there?" Stupidly, Colin looked down at the knife, which had slipped from the folds of his cloak and gleamed in the lamplight. Their eyes met. "No!" the man shouted.
Didn't we cover this?
So Colin stabbed him,
If
or
we knew for
tried.
certain,
The man's
we wouldn't be
palms
sending you
came up
everything-
and the knife
everything
cut
you
into
uncovered,
them.
such as
Colin
the
reached
staff
with
and
his left
certain
hand
things
to
that
try
you
to
don't
slap
want.
them aside and
Explain.
thrust
The
again,
people don't have
this
to
time
explain.
slicing
Yes.
deep
If
into
we
the
knew
forearm.
everything you uncovered,
Just
such as
stop
the
it!
staff,
The man gasped.
Wait a minute, talk!
If we knew for certain,
The
we
knife
wouldn't be sending
slipped
you
past the
everything-
thrashing
everything
limbs
you
and
uncovered,
sank into his solar plexus. His mouth still working, the fellow staggered back, staring at his hand and arm.
What are you doing?
He asked. Colin took a step toward the man, who slumped against the banister.
Don't!
He wheezed.
I have to.
Colin whispered. He stooped down. The man's arms came up, too weak now to stop Colin from cutting his throat. The corpse slipped to a sitting position. Colin slid down next to him and watched the students, distant now, entirely unaware of what had just happened. Unlike the 2 men coming from the city, who were walking purposefully toward him, Colin put his arms around the dead man's shoulders, as if the fellow had passed out from drinking and he was keeping him warm. But there wasn't any need for that. One of the pair was a tall, bald man with angular features, the other an almost snoutless Khajiit. Arcus